This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 47 are the writers of the play The Analyst and The Rabbi, Murray Stein and Henry Abramovitch. Dr. Abramovitch holds a Ph.D. from Yale University and a Diploma in Analytical Psychology, which is the degree of a Jungian analyst from the Israeli Society of Analytical Psychology. He is currently Professor Emeritus in the Department of Medical Education at the Sackler School of Medicine at Tel Aviv. He is founding president and a senior training analyst at the Israeli Institute for Jungian Psychology, and is the former president of the Israeli Anthropological Association, as well as co-facilitator of the Interfaith Encounter Association. Dr. Abramovitch supervises routers in the International Association for Analytical Psychology's developing groups in Poland, Serbia, and Moscow. He is the author of Brothers and Sisters, Myth and Reality, and two forthcoming books, Therapy as Performance Art, and Why Odysseus Came Home, As a Stranger, and Other Puzzling Moments in the Life of Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, Abraham, and other great individuals. Murray Stein holds a Ph.D. from Yale University and a Diploma in Analytical Psychology from the C.G. Jung Institute, Zürich. He is currently a training and supervising analyst at the International School of Analytical Psychology, Zürich. He served as president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology from 2001 to 2004, and president of the International School of Analytical Psychology from 2008 to 2012. Dr. Stein is the author of many books and articles, including Jung's Map of the Soul, In Midlife, and The Bible as Dream. Their play, The Analyst and the Rabbi, was performed on stage at the Foyer St. Anton in Zurich on October 29, 2018, and filmed for DVD release. The screenplay, along with extensive commentary by the writers and actors, is available in book format. The Analyst and the Rabbi will be featured at this year's IAAP Congress, where it will be screened at the Audimax Hall at the University of Vienna on Wednesday, August 28th at 8:00 p.m., followed by a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Yehuda Abramovitch. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, August 7th, 2019, through the magic of Skype. Welcome, Dr. Stein, Dr. Abramovitch. Hi.
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 This play, The Analyst and the Rabbi, has affected me very deeply, as you could probably hear by the sound of my voice. Where should we start? How did this come about?
Well, why don't I start and then Murray will continue.
Great.
For many years, I wished Murray to come to Israel to give some lectures because we had deep respect for him. And I finally convinced him to come. And he said, I don't want to give a lecture. Let's have a conversation in front of an audience. And we did. And Murray was extremely open. People asked him about how he felt about Jung's anti-Semitism. And he spoke very personally and even cried about hearing something bad about your grandfather, no, your father, and so forth. And then the next day, I took him on a trip to the Dead Sea. And we went up to the amazing site of Masada. And at Masada, as we were walking around, we realized that we had both been at Yale around the same time. Why don't you continue the story? And I told Murray that when I was an undergraduate, I had been involved in theater. And Murray, why don't you continue from there?
Okay. Well, Henry and I have known each other for quite a few years, but I didn't know this about him, that we both attended Yale University, not exactly in the same years, but not too far apart either. And I had been thinking about this play for a period of time, maybe a year or two. And I got interested in the conversation that happened between C.G. Jung and Rabbi Leo Baeck in 1946, reading some biographies of Jung. And I wondered what that conversation was about. There's almost nothing written about it. There were no minutes taken. of their meeting. So I did a little research on it, and I was beginning to put together some ideas for a play, but I didn't know anything much about Rabbi Baeck, and I didn't know how a rabbi would think and speak. I grew up in a Christian family. My father was actually a Christian minister, a kind of a Christian version of the rabbi. And I knew a lot about Jung, and I had an idea of how he would carry on in a conversation, but I was puzzled about how to put the words into Rabbi Baeck's mouth. And when Henry and I were walking there on Masada, it suddenly hit me, here is my partner. Here is Rabbi Baeck. Here is somebody who would know how a rabbi would speak in a very difficult, fraught situation like this. So I explained to Henry what I was thinking about, and I asked him if he would be interested in joining me to write a play about this topic, this moment in Jung's life. And he jumped on it. He loved the idea from the beginning. And so it just took off, and we worked together very harmoniously and productively, back and forth for, I don't know, how long was it, Henry? A couple of years, and maybe 100 revisions by the time we finished with the play. And in a sense, Henry is Rabbi Baeck's voice and I'm Jung's voice, but it wasn't all that clear either, because we challenged each other all along the way. Would Jung have really said this? Would Baeck have said that? And so it's really a composite of our combined imaginations. We're sort of like Rodgers and Hammerstein, I guess, coming together, two people with different abilities and talents. And Henry has the theater experience. I have no theater experience, although I majored in English literature at Yale. But I never was involved in theater, but I love theater. I love to go to theater. But Henry had the background of theater, so he kept challenging. We've got to make this more dramatic. We've got to make this more, theater. And so he was a wonderful partner in that sense, putting this play together.
And it sure is dramatic. And we all know who Jung was. Would you tell us who Rabbi Baeck was?
Henry?
Yes, Rabbi Baeck was the leader of German Jewry in the 1920s and 1930s and led the spiritual resistance against the Germans and the Nazis. Very unusually, he was a Reform rabbi, but was a leader of all aspects of German Jewry, from the ultra-Orthodox to the secular Jews. He was a very upright and ethical man. He was at one point taken by the Germans to a camp, a very well-known camp of Theresienstadt, which is 40 kilometers north of Prague, and was kept there as a prisoner. And in the beginning, he worked as a slave laborer. He said, I was a horse. I would move dead bodies and so forth. And when the Dutch Jews were coming, he heard the names of the Dutch Jews and he remembered the great depth of Dutch and Jewish cultural life. And he began to create this fantastic cultural activity at Theresienstadt of operas, children operas, cabarets, art shows, and many, many other things. He almost, at the very end of the war, he had this meeting, which is in the play, where he meets Eichmann, and Eichmann is shocked that he's alive. And at this Dostoevsky-like moment where they were going to shoot him, and then the camp was liberated, so forth. He survived the war, and we have texts which we include in the play of how he felt when he was on the plane leaving Auschwitz by the American pilot, who wrote down what he said, to see a meadow and how he felt about that. After the war, he was very active in restoring the destroyed communities, and that's why he'd come to Zurich. And initially, as we have in the play, he definitely did not want to see Jung and resisted seeing them. And we know this. We have historical proof from letters in the Jung archive that Baeck initially refused to see Jung.
But what was their history, the history between Jung and Rabbi Baeck before all of that?
Yes.
I would like to just say a word about that. Rabbi Baeck was very well known in his time. He was a very famous figure, similar to Buber. Martin Buber and Rabbi Leo Baeck were among the Jewish celebrities, let's say, and in Germany of their day. And Jung met Rabbi Baeck at the School of Wisdom. Count Hermann von Keyserling set up a school in Germany called the School of Wisdom, and many famous intellectuals went there and lectured. And that's where Jung met quite a number of people and struck up relationships with them. And Rabbi Baeck was there in the audience when Jung gave a lecture. I think it was in 1928 or 1930. And after that lecture, Jung had to rush off. He didn't have time to stay around and talk to people. So Rabbi Baeck wrote a letter to Jung, a letter of appreciation, saying how valuable he found Jung's writings for his work as a pastor, as a rabbi counseling his flock, and so on. A letter of very warm appreciation, to which Jung never responded. But that letter is in the archives, and that's one of the few documents that we have that tells us anything at all about their relationship. They were also connected to each other somewhat indirectly through a woman named Olga Frebe-Kapitein, who was the founder of the Eranos conferences. And she had contacted Jung in 1932 to involve him in her vision of setting up these conferences, a dialogue between East and West, the religious traditions of all the peoples of the world, basically. And she was also made acquaintance or made a friendship with Rabbi Baeck, and so Leo Baeck was connected to Jung indirectly. And after the war, in 1947, both Jung and Baeck were at Eranos. This is after their meeting in Zürich that we dramatize in the play. They were both at the Eranos lecture in 1947. Both gave lectures there, and there's a picture of them sitting together at the round table at Eranos that's we've used on the cover of the book.
Yes.
So obviously they were in a good position to have a conversation and a dialogue at that point.
Right.
So that's more or less their history. And after that meeting, there were some exchanges between them through Olga Kapitein, but I don't think they ever met again after that Eranos meeting. And Jung died in 1961. Baeck died when Henry, in the early 60s sometime.
Yeah, 65, I think he died.
Yeah, they were just about the same age, almost exactly the same.
And it was like, yeah, but there was one other connection between them. Count Keyserling, who had founded the School of Wisdom, edited a very fascinating book of marriage.
That's right. Yeah.
In which many interesting people contribute chapters, including Jung and Baeck. And it's very telling to see their very different views of what marriage is like. There's one phrase that of Baeck's that I like. He fell in love with his wife, and he was this kind of one-woman man. But he wrote, "Love begins in poetry, but is lived out in prose."
Marriage begins in poetry and is lived out in prose. Wasn't that it? Yeah, that's a great line. Jung's contribution to that book, I think it was in the early 20s, wasn't it, 23 or 24? Jung's contribution made the famous distinction between the container and the contained.
Oh, right.
And Jung said that one marriage partner is the container and the other is the contained. Contained, the more complex personality is the container, the less complex is the contained. And it's been criticized somewhat for that, but that concept of container and contained was picked up by Bion later and used quite a lot in Bion's psychoanalytic writings. And it's not a bad concept. It's just one can't use it too mechanically, but I think most couples have that experience. At least in some areas, one is the container and the other contained. In other areas, it might be the other way around. But it's another point of contact between Baeck and Jung. They both were very interested in marriage and relationships, had quite different experience of them. Baeck being, as Henry said, a one-woman man, Jung not so much, maybe, according to stories anyway.
So they knew each other, they respected each other's work, and then the war happened, right?
No, I think it was long before the war. Jung wrote a few things in certainly 1933, 34, which, how can I put it, could easily be interpreted as anti-Semitic, even supporting a Nazi worldview. And I think at that point, Jung, who had been followed very much by Baeck and his congregation, was very put off by this and distanced himself from Jung.
As did many of Jung's Jewish followers. I mean, that notorious article that Henry is speaking about was published in 1934 when Jung was the president of the International Medical Psychotherapy Association, and put his Jewish, close Jewish followers in a very awkward position. And there are letters between Jung and Erich Neumann, for instance, and Jung and James Kirsch, his closest, among his closest Jewish disciples, if you want to call them that, his students. Very challenging what he said, because the tone of that article, which can be interpreted in several ways, played into the anti-Semitic, very strong anti-Semitic atmosphere that was gathering force after Hitler took power in 1933, and Jewish doctors could no longer belong to medical associations. Jewish professionals were thrown out of their professional societies. In Jung's favor, he did make an arrangement with the International Psychotherapy Association to allow for individual members to be a part of it, so that the German Jewish analysts could remain members despite the fact that they could not belong to the German association that was a part of that society. It was a complex moment, but it really, that was one of the, and we put that in the play very strongly, one of the moments that, and statements that Jung is most heavily criticized for, when he says it speaks about Jewish psychology, and he says the Jew has to live in a host country, hasn't created a culture of his own. And it's sort of, he doesn't use the word parasite, but it plays into that kind of formulation of the Jew as other, similar to what we're experiencing in our time with others coming into people from other cultures and religions coming into Europe and the United States, and the migrant issue and the religion issue that's such a hot topic today. That was the issue in Germany in the 1930s with the German nationalists and Nazis calling out the Jews as others, not of our people, a different race, all this nonsense, mostly out of envy because the Jews were very successful in there.
Yes, and I just would like to jump in. If anybody would like to read this, the article is called The State of Psychotherapy Today. It is in volume 10 of Jung's collected works, which is titled Civilization in Transition, and there will be links to all of those on the website.
Very good. I think it is important to say that it's unclear why Jung became so fascinated by this, whether it was, as Baeck suggests in the play, he was an opportunist, or whether he generally was taken over by a kind of collective complex. And nobody, I think, thinks that Jung was personally anti-Semitic. He continued to have Jewish friends throughout his life. He had warm relationships. As we talk about the play, he had these these visions, the Kabbalistic visions in chapter 10 of Memory, Dreams, and Reflections. He was drawn to Jewish things. Many of his most important patients, like Sabine Spielrein,
Yes.
Jewish. So he was unconsciously drawn to this, but he had a kind of blindness at this time and didn't see the implications of what he was arguing. He did apparently make private apologies, apparently, to James Kirsch, but he definitely did not make a public apology. And this is something very alive in the Jungian world today, because there are calls that an apology should be made to Howard, to blacks or primitives. There was a ultimately successful call, I think, in your time when you were president, Murray, to the Jung Club for having a numerous clauses for the percentage of Jews who are allowed to join the Jung Club in Zurich, and not just in wartime. I think long afterwards. So it's easily to project the otherness, the shadow, onto Jews, and then they lose their humanity.
One of the things we write about in our exchange after the play that's published in the book, we have a conversation, Henry and I. And Henry, can you say a few words about Jung's reputation in Israel when you were training there? Was he looked upon as by your colleagues in the field of psychology and psychotherapy as anti-Semitic?
Well, I think there were two aspects. The people who were those who trained me were very much disciples, even the harem of Erich Neumann. And they saw themselves very much as disciples of Neumann and much less so of Jung. But in Israel, and also like in Yale and other places, even though Jung gave the famous Terry lectures at Yale, which are landmarks in the field of psychology, I would meet many people who would say, how can you be Jewish and a Jungian analyst?
Right.
And I think this was the difference in the way we approached the play, which is this was an issue that I had been grappling and struggling with since the beginning of my training. And I think one of the reasons that convinced me to train in the end was that on the eve of deciding to train, I think my interviews, I had a dream where I came up and I knocked at a door, and the door opened and Jung invited me into his house. And so I felt I was being accepted. I was in a way that I hadn't. That is, being Jewish, one was Freudian. That was the home for the Jewish psychology. That was Gemütlichkeit. That was, regular. So there is, and one still hears, inaccurate statements. Jung was a Nazi. It's true that he was giving lectures in Berlin even as late as 1938. But he never was a Nazi. He certainly was pro-British during the war, and even he was in the American Secret Service.
How did that rumor start that Jung was a Nazi?
Well, we mentioned this article from 1934. That was the beginning of it. I don't think before that, maybe Freud made some comments about, the Freudian circle. The people around Freud in Vienna, I think, were all Jews. And when Jung entered that in 1907, he went and visited Freud. I think he was the only non-Jewish member of the group at that time. And Freud saw him as a way to expand the influence of psychoanalysis outside of, the Jewish community. And so Jung was like his knight, carrying the message of psychoanalysis into the larger world of German psychiatry, because Jung was very well connected to that world, to the world of psychiatry through his association with Bleuler in Zurich at the Berkowitz Clinic. But when they broke, and during the time that they were together, there's a letter that Freud wrote to Karl Abraham about Jung. And Freud says to Abraham, it's easier for you because we are of the same tribe. Can't remember the exact words he used, but we're both Jews. It's easier for you to accept the my ideas about the psyche and about psychoanalysis than it is for Jung. It's harder for Jung because he's a Christian. He has a Christian background.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that it was Freud's camp who was behind this rumor that Jung was a Nazi?
Well, I don't know. Jung had some enemies. There were people in the world who wanted to make Jung look bad and were afraid of Jung's influence and didn't like it. So maybe some of them, but some of his enemies were not Jews. I mean, they just didn't like Jung.
Right.
They thought his psychology was either nonsense or mystical or misleading. So it was a combination of things, but pinning the Nazi thing on him, I think that gathered some steam in the 1930s. And then at the end of the war, there were all kinds of rumors flying around in the United States. There are letters between Jung and Esther Harding, for instance, who lived in New York, and Eleanor Bertin. And they are telling him that in the United States, there are rumors going around that you are being investigated by the FBI. There's even a rumor that you're hiding somewhere in the United States. I mean, extreme, crazy rumors.
Right. And we used that at the beginning of the play. That's really how the play begins.
That's how the play begins, yeah.
I think it was, I mean, we don't know, I mean, but I think it was these essays that he wrote that could be read as very supportive of this. And also, remember, this is a time that's leading up to McCarthy. So you have like anonymous accusations.
Yeah.
These are taken then as proof that this person is suspicious or unworthy. It's interesting to contrast Heidegger, who was, the leading German philosopher, who was a complete Nazi. He was, got rid of Jewish professors, including his own teacher. He never renounced his Nazism. He was the lover of Hannah Arendt, who wrote so nastily about Baeck, called him the Jewish Führer, even though she was having this affair before and after, and trained him to pass the denazification exams. And somehow nobody says hardly any bad things about Heidegger. Heidegger at all the universities, and nobody says this. And the likelihood that his Nazism infiltrated his theory is much more likely that Jung's flirtation influenced his theory.
Now, what I find interesting, and please forgive me if I'm off base here, but most people who know about Jung know about his relationship with Sabine Spielrein, who was a huge figure and did some great work, which maybe not a lot of people know about. I'm going to put a link to the documentary that was made about her. My name was Sabine Spielrein on the website. But she was eventually murdered by Nazis, she and her 2 children. And this, I think, affected Jung very deeply. And then, so that's a huge figure in Jung's life. And then Freud was a Jew. So when I first discovered Jung and I learned about Sabine, of course, about Freud, I never thought of Jung as being anti-Semitic. I had heard the rumors, but always brushed them off. So I thought, how could that be? That's not possible. So what he wrote in 1934, could that be because of his, I don't know, those relationships, maybe some kind of hangover from them?
Could be. Of course, we include that very importantly in the play, and also Sabine Spielrein. We put a dream into Jung's psyche, which there's documentary evidence for that, but that seemed, plausible at least, that he would have had such a reaction upon hearing of Sabine's being murdered by the stormtroopers in Rostov on Don. And So his relationship to Jews was long and complex. And when he said those words in 1934, he might have been unconsciously, and this is what we put in the play, everybody has a shadow. He might have been unconsciously getting back at Freud. Now, the thing is, when Jung talks about Jewish psychology in that article, he's really, in my opinion, talking about Freud and Freudian psychology, Freudian psychoanalysis. And he's saying that there are that Freud's psychology, Freudian psychoanalysis, is specifically Jewish and doesn't apply to Aryans necessarily in the same way. And he's making space for himself and for his psychology to take a bigger role in the German professional world. And that's why he was accused of being an opportunist, that he's pushing Freud aside. He's saying Freudian psychoanalysis is for Jews, but my analytical psychology is for the Aryans, because I'm a Germanic, belong to Germanic people, and my psychology is more fitting for working with patients who are not Jewish. He doesn't say that in so many terms, but it's the subtext there. And so that's why he's been accused of being opportunistic, because Germany was the big prize, as we say in the play. Germany was seen as sort of the pinnacle of culture and sophisticated modern ideas, philosophical and psychological, and to have a strong foothold in German culture was a big deal. And Jung benefited in that sense from Freud's expulsion. They burned Freud's books publicly, and the Freudian psychoanalysts, most of whom were Jewish, could no longer practice as medical doctors and so on. And Jung got a privileged position.
Well, I agree with you, Murray, but I would add another way of looking at this is one of Jung's great contributions is the concept of a complex, which he was really the first to talk about it, and then Freud and, all psychologists have taken this on. So I might have a mother complex and I want people to look after me and so forth. But more recently, we talk about cultural complexes. So cultural complex, similarly to personal complex, have a certain way to do this. And European society certainly has a anti-Semitic cultural complex, which is a tendency to see the Jews as the other, to see them as stigmatized, to see them as carrying a historical burden of guilt, that is, they killed Christ, which is something they can never atone for. Whatever they are, they're either too rich or dirty. In any case, or they become, as the Nazis said, they become like a cancer on the body, on this, the idea. Therefore, we have to remove them. So I think Jung fell into that cultural complex, which was very available to him because, as we say in the play, he didn't really he didn't really know Jews. He didn't have friends of Jews. He lived in a very environment where they wouldn't have interactions typically with Jews. It's very interesting to look at the opposite side of the European culture. Studies during the Holocaust of people who became what we call righteous Gentiles, as people who saved Jews at the risk to their own life and families, who are recognized in Jerusalem at Yad Vashem. These are people who very often did have contact with Jews. They were their neighbors, they were their partners, they were friends, and therefore they were very, very much humanized. And what's amazing is that when you talk to these people who saved these Jews, I mean, it's a fantastic thing that they did. And you say, well, why did you do it? Your whole family could have been exterminated by the Nazis. And they say, I didn't do anything special. Anybody would have done this. It's so not true, but that's the way they see it. And that's what makes somebody into a kind of a saintly person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you say that in the beginning that this is a play. Dr. Stein, you say this is a play about the shadow and facing up to it. And then Dr. Abramovitch, you say a great man has a great shadow. And I love that because I think for me personally, I find the most important part of Jungian psychology is the work on the shadow. So I think that this play is a really great example of that. And another question that the play raises is, Rabbi Baeck asks Jung, why did you not speak out even when you knew? So let's get into that now. We know what Jung said and did, but then why didn't he speak out about it after? Because Dr. Abramovitch, you say that part of you is, or was this Dr. Baeck, so angry at Jung, right? That Dr. Baeck didn't want to speak, or Rabbi Baeck didn't want to speak with him, but the other side knows that the right thing to do is to speak with him and confront him about it.
But that's a very good point you made, Laura. That's why we have the woman in the play.
Right,
we have three characters in the play. We have Jung and we have Baeck, and then we have a woman that floats between them. Mm-hmm. She's just called woman. And she's a figure that speaks for the other side. And when Baeck is saying, I just don't want to see him, I don't want to meet with him, she's saying, but you should, give him a chance, hear him out. That's the other side of Baeck speaking. So the woman is speaking for that position, that Baeck in his, you could say, minority side, knows it's the right thing to do. On the third knock, answer the door, and he finally does it. And the woman brings them together, makes it possible for them to meet. So she speaks for the chance of restoring a relationship and possible reconciliation.
And I would like to clarify with both of you, for this character of woman, which in the credits, it's just woman in double quotes. And for all the women out there that are going to take issue with this, I'd like for both of you to clarify why she's not given a name and why she's just sort of, she's kind of like the Greek chorus, right? She's the inner presence, the inner voice of both of them. And she's actually played brilliantly by a Jungian analyst, Darian Pictet.
Yes, I think Darian did a marvelous job playing that. Henry and I went back and forth about whether even to include her. We could have written the play without her. Mm-hmm. One reason I'd say a minor reason we put her in there was that at ISAP we have this ensemble, the four of us who have worked together on a number of performances of Jung's letters and other things, and Darian has always been a part of it. So we had to find a place for her. That's one reason. But the other is that we wanted an anima figure. We could have called her anima, but that's a kind of jargon word, so we just called her woman. But this is she represents their. She goes between them. She's like a common Eros figure. She wants to bring them together. She wants them to tell the truth. She wants them to speak out. They find it very difficult. So in their egos, they are having a hard time. But there's this other figure that's putting some Eros pressure on them, encouraging them, sometimes saying their unspoken thoughts. In the end, I felt that she plays an essential role in the whole story of facing the shadow, coming to terms with it, and where do you go once you've done that? That was a big question we had toward the end too.
Yeah, I'm going to say it. I mean, we called her a woman because we didn't know what else to call her, because she plays about 20 different roles in the play. She plays Jung's wife. She plays Beck's wife, even though Beck's wife had died long ago, but as though the image. She holds them together, She comments on the scene. She plays a Nazi at Theresienstadt. She plays a woman asking whether she should go with her husband, the exact opposite. So she plays these multiple roles. And even though I think she's there because her presence is so striking, the audience immediately understands who she is, even though she's always changing what she is and who she is. And that, I think, then allows the ending, which we really struggled over so much.
Yes.
Did you? It's beautiful.
Spirit guide, of like, where should we go? Where do we go from now? And with a sense of humor, helping a kind of reconciliation, not only between the men, but also within each man to continue looking for the way.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So how did Jung change after this? And how did the two men come out of their meeting at this hotel in 1946? How did they come away from it different?
Well, we have a document there that we include in the appendix of the book. And that's a letter from Gershom Shaloms, the famous Jewish scholar of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and so on, who was a lecturer at Eranos and knew Jung. And he wrote to Jung's secretary, Aniela Jaffe, who was also Jewish. Jung was very close to Aniela Jaffe. Right. And she testified after the war. She has a book. There's a chapter in one of her books about Jung and anti-Semitism, which is very, very powerful. And in that chapter, she quotes this letter that she got from Gershom Shaloms. And Gershom Shaloms says that he had a conversation with Rabbi Baeck in Jerusalem. And Gershom Shaloms had been invited to give a lecture at Eranos, but he didn't know if he should go because Eranos was tainted with a reputation of being Nazi-oriented or anti-Semitic. Again, unfairly, that's another long story. But he wasn't sure he should go. So he knew that Baeck had a relationship and continued to have a relationship with Olga Frey-Kapitan, the organizer and sponsor of the Eranos conferences. So he talked to Baeck about whether he should go to Eranos or not. And Baeck, according to Shaloms, said in the conversation several times that in this meeting with Jung in 1946 in Zurich, Jung, in that conversation several times used the phrase, "Ich bin ausgerutscht." Ich bin ausgerutscht. Several times he said it, and Baeck emphasizes that. And with that in mind and in hand, Shaloms was convinced that it was okay to go and participate at the Eranos conferences, which he did very actively after that. Now that phrase, "Ich bin ausgerutscht," has been debated. What does it mean? How convincing is that? And when it's translated, and Henry and I had this conversation early on when we wrote the play, and Henry was surprised when I said, "Ich bin ausgerutscht" means I slipped off the path. Sometimes it's translated as a kind of flippant, "Oh, I slipped up." Now, if all Jung had said to Baeck was, "Oh, I'm sorry, I slipped up," Baeck wouldn't have taken it very seriously. It would be meaningless. So what? Okay, you slipped up. That wasn't enough. What he meant by "Ich bin ausgerutscht" was much more serious than that. And if you translate it, "I slipped off the path." And that's what we have Jung say a couple of times toward the end of the play when he sees himself through Baeck's eyes, when he sees himself the way Baeck sees him, then he can see behind himself, so to speak. Then he can see his shadow and he can say, I slipped off the path. And what he means by that is, I really lost my way. And what Henry says about falling into a cultural complex, I think is much to the point. We all do that from time to time. Mm-hmm. We feel and say things we don't really know what we're doing until afterwards we realize, oh my goodness, that's much more serious than I thought it was. And then you see yourself through the eyes of the one who is suffering because of what you're saying. And when Jung sees himself in that light, then he can say, Ich bin ausgerutscht. And he says it very seriously in the play. And we have him say it as he's in his inner world. He's hearing the Dies Irae from Verdi's Requiem. And again, the woman says the lines, so she participates in this chanting, it is the day of judgment, it is the day of wrath, the judge will come.
Yeah, and we haven't even spoken about the music in the play, which is very powerful. It's Barbara Miller on cello. She is also a Jungian analyst. And there's music by Vivaldi and Beethoven and Bach, and it provides, it's almost like another character to me.
Yes, music from Theresienstadt, which he researched and found. Music was actually written in Theresienstadt by the inmates.
Right.
They were extremely, remarkably gifted, talented people at Theresienstadt.
Yes. And something that Murray knew, but I didn't know till very recently, is that Verdi's Requiem was performed 17 times in the Theresienstadt camp. So it was a song, a memorial song that spoke very much to them to be able to mourn and deal with their impossible situation that they were going through.
But yeah, it's the promise that there will be judgment one day. And they sang it to the Nazis sitting in front of them as though they were just singing some nice music, opera music, Verdi's Requiem. But it has this powerful message. You folks sitting out there in the audience, there will be a judgment day coming. And there was Nuremberg. Not very far off.
So, I think he was more able to grapple with the issues of evil in the world and in himself. I think you also see a transformation in the photographs. When he was a young man, you have a very famous picture of him. He has these round metal glasses. He seems to me very uptight and, obsessional and things like that.
And like a Junker, yeah.
Later on, you see he relaxes. His face becomes more feminine. He's more at ease. He's more playful. He has a positive trickster quality to him. And in the way that I think Memories, Dreams, Reflection has been so important to many people, not just as a story about Jung, but a story that we can have a story also. We can go up through a process just like Jung went through a process.
Right.
And we include also in the play Jung's famous vision of the garden of pomegranates, the Pardes Rimonim, and the marriage of Malkut and Teferet. It's a Kabbalistic vision, and Jung is identified with the founder of Kabbalah. And so in Jung's inner process, this was 1944 during the war, there was a tremendous transformation going on in him. And this is revealed in his conversation with Baeck. And once Baeck sees that Jung has changed, that he's no longer, the famous, arrogant Jung that maybe wrote those earlier lines, that he has come to terms with his shadow and what he had put on the Jews. And not only that, had deeply connected to the Jewish soul, as we say in the play. He could, we don't say he forgives Jung. He doesn't, there's nothing about forgiveness in this. Henry taught me that about the Christian concept of forgiveness doesn't apply. But there was reconciliation and there was resolution to do something. And that's where we bring in tikkun olam. What do you do once you have seen the shadow? Of course, you make an apology and you make a confession and so on, but you have to do something. Mm-hmm. And that's tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. And again, I think Henry's input into the play taught me a lot about what that means, what tikkun olam means. I'd heard that phrase before and, took it rather lightly, but it's a very, very serious step in, that follows the recognition of the shadow. And without that step, it's kind of a shallow thing, just making an apology.
Yeah, would you say a little bit about that, Dr. Abramovitch?
Well, the tikkun olam comes from the Kabbalistic view that God filled up the whole world and there was no place to create the world. And therefore, God had to reduce himself to create space in which the world would be created. In the process of creation, through the different levels, certain parts of the light escaped and went into the fragments outside of creation, into the dark shards. And in order to complete the world, to repair the world, one has to go into, as it were, the dark side to find these shards, these broken parts of the world, and redeem the light and restore them to the world. So that's the conceptual idea of tikkun olam. But it's not something very abstract. Dr. Stein and I were talking about this very practical case of this drunken driver who had killed the son of a rabbi. And he then he went to the rabbi and asked for forgiveness. And the rabbi said, I will forgive you, but you have to start repairing the world. Mm-hmm. You have to promise me that you will drink no alcohol, that you will be an advocate in every school in our county against reckless driving, that you have to go and actively prevent accidents, that you have to do all of those things. And if you do all of those things as part of repairing the world, then I might forgive you.
And yeah, that's the important step. You see, I mean, it's like Jesus saying to the rich young ruler, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and then you can follow me. Mm-hmm. And he walked away. He wouldn't do it. So these are the hard steps, and that's what we want to conclude the play with, that going into the future, maybe we'll write a sequel to the play, Henry, sometime, and reflect on that. But how did Jung go about doing that after his meeting with Rabbi Baeck? We could imagine some of the actions that he took. For instance, this quota that was put on in the psychology club in Zürich, quota on Jews, I think it was instituted in 1944. When Jung found out about it, he probably knew about it at the beginning, but when he found out about it, when a Jewish friend of his wanted to join the club, he insisted that they take it off the books or he would leave the club. And of course, he was the club, so that he couldn't very well refuse him. But so they took it off the books immediately. But actions, that's a small one, but actions like that go into this idea of tikkun olam, that you don't just make an apology and do nothing further. You take action.
Right. And so Jung was transformed by this meeting, and I think it's a great example of how we need others as mirrors to see ourselves. And quite possibly yes. Jung would not have seen himself had he not had this meeting with Rabbi Baeck. And so I think that's very important. And also in conclusion, I'd like to ask you how this can be applied today to our current situation. Can it?
Well, let me start. I think if it could be applied today, it means that when you see an example of injustice or intolerance, you have to immediately or as soon as possible confront the person in a very soulful way, not a judgmental way, but try to get them to face up to the responsibility of what they're doing, rather than just to say, oh, what's the point, or so forth. You've had some terrible incidents in the States this past week, these shootings. Perhaps, I'm not saying it would have stopped them, but if somebody had called them on these racist or intolerant views, maybe it would have happened. Maybe they would have had some moment of self-reflection. I mean, it could be that I'm fooling myself, but you can never lose anything by saying, reflect on what you're doing. Why do you think it bothers me what you did? So,
but, Henry, even if it wouldn't have any effect, it's still important to do it. Now, Henry has been very involved in the dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis in his part of the world. Henry lives in Jerusalem. He and his wife are very involved in attempts at dialogue and working with the other in his context. So, even if it doesn't change the world and the bad guys keep getting elected over and over again, it's still important to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Before I wrap this up, is there anything else that either one of you would like to mention?
I would like to say a word about the music. Barbara Miller worked very hard on making precise selections of musical pieces that she plays on the cello. She's a professional musician. Mm-hmm. She was for years in a professional orchestra in Holland. She's now a Jungian analyst and still plays the cello beautifully. And she made the selection and she played those pieces, and she does it very soulfully. And if you see it on the film, you will catch that. Just reading the book, you might not catch that the flavor of it so much unless you know the pieces. And as I said before, she did research into the music that was composed at Theresienstadt and wove that in. So that's, as you said, Laura, like a fourth character.
Yes.
And the musical element is very important.
Let me just add how deeply satisfying it was working with Murray as a partner and now as a brother, and how we agreed from the beginning that we would be honest with each other and not be hurt. We'd be speaking for the benefit of the work, the way we work as analysts, to continue the work together. And it was amazing.
It was. I would absolutely second that. And I don't have a brother myself. I don't even know that I missed one, but I've had partnerships with quite a few people in doing work, and never a better one than with Henry. And I feel, too, like you're a brother to me, Henry, and that we've worked together in honesty and with respect. And I really appreciate the differences between us and the similarities. I think it worked out extremely well.
Again, The Analyst and The Rabbi is available on DVD from Chiron Publications. There will be a link to that on the website, and it's also available in book form, in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed here today. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and now on iHeartRadio. With special thanks to Chiron Publications, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.